Hello and welcome back to my shop. I'm Ryan, and today I have a fun project I'm excited to share with you all. What I love about this project is that 1, it is very cheap to make. I'm making mine out of a single piece of pine I got from Home Depot. And 2, although this is a small project, it is still packed with many different joints and is a perfect project for practicing different joinery techniques. It requires cutting 2 dados, 4 wedged mortise and tenons, 8 dovetail-like joints, and 2 curved cuts, making this a great project if you're wanting to practice some of your hand tool work. Now before I get too far, I want to give credit where credit is due and mention that this is not my design. I took this design from a fine woodworking article / plan that's done by Christian Bexford. Put a link in the article in the description for anyone interested in learning more, and a huge thanks to Christian and those at Fine Woodworking for providing the plans to this project. So with the introduction out of the way, what you've seen me doing so far is strategically breaking down this piece to yield 3 clean pieces of wood. Whenever you venture into buying Home Depot lumber, you know no matter what, you're going to have some knots to deal with. So when I was searching through the boards at Home Depot, I looked for one that would give me at least 1 clear section at least 20 inches long, and 2 sections at least 9 inches long. I found one with a nice, almost straight-grained, even 20-inch section, and then for 2 leg supports, you'll notice I cut the pieces, but left a single knot in the bottom middle of the board. I was able to leave this knot here because, as you'll see later on, I'll be cutting out half circles from the legs, which conveniently enough means I'll be able to cut these knots out. So with my pieces rough cut to size, I could then move on to milling everything square into their final dimensions. As always begins by using my winding sticks to get one face flat. Unlike previous videos though, my milling process has changed somewhat, and that's because I bought a thickness planer. So with using my hand plane to get one face flat on all my boards, I could then run each board through the thickness planer a couple times to get all my pieces to the same thickness. This was my first major machine purchase, but one I'm super excited I made, because the part of hand milling process I find the most time consuming and difficult is getting the second face parallel into the final thickness. Usually this part of the process takes me a good 10 or 15 minutes, or even sometimes longer to complete per board. And so having this planer that'll let me thickness all my boards in a matter of minutes to a more precise finished result is going to be so nice and such a time saver. Eventually I want to add a jointer and a bandsaw to my collection, so I can do all my milling with power tools. I love hand tool work, but after milling boards by hand for a couple years now, I can confidently say that the part of hand tool work just isn't for me. I love hand cut joinery, but milling boards by hand just feels so time consuming, and not something I'm interested in doing forever. Anyway, back to the build. After finishing up milling everything to size, I could then move on to cutting the half circles on each leg. For this, I used my rusty coping saw that I should really get a new blade for, and then since I don't have a spoke shave, I grabbed a 3/4 inch dowel and a piece of sandpaper to do the final shaping. With both semicircles cut, I could then move on to creating a shallow dado in the top piece of the stool. For creating dados like this, I like to set up a fence for my saw to ride against to cut the walls of the dado. This is something I've started using more and more, and I found it provides a fantastic result that is much more reliable than trying to cut a straight line freehand, especially with a cut this long. I find it doesn't take much more time to set up the fence, and the benefits is well worth the extra prep. So with both sides cut, I could then use my router plane to remove the waste until I reached a depth of an 1/8 inch. Once the dado was cut, I could then cut out the tenons. While cutting the tenons, I took this as a great opportunity to practice cutting directly to my line. Something I want to get better at is being able to cut square and plumb directly to my line, so I don't have to do any cleanup with a chisel. I found for me that it can be harder to get things square from a chisel than it is to just get a square cut from my saw. Which I mentioned at the beginning, but hopefully you can see how this project provides many great opportunities to practice fundamental hand tool skills. So with the tenons cut, I could then move on to cutting out the mortises. Fortunately, the thickness of the legs ended up being slightly less than 3/4 of an inch, which was my initial intention, and as a result I couldn't use my 3/4 inch chisel, but had to use my 1/2 inch chisel, which made cutting out the waste a little bit more difficult. Another frustrating bit was that even though I scored the edges of the mortise wall, since the pine is so soft, I ended up with a lot of chip out on top. You'll see this throughout the video, that some spots were larger than others, but it was pretty frustrating because everything up to this point had been super clean and precise. Once all 4 mortises were cut, I could then assemble the legs, ensure they were square with a clamp, and then lay out and mark out cuts for the leg supports. I mentioned wanting to get a more perfect cut from the saw previously, but I found starting the cut on an angled piece of wood to be pretty challenging, and therefore had to go back in with the chisel and do quite a bit of cleanup work to get a square cut out. With the little cutouts made on the support piece, I could then lay the support piece back onto the stool and transfer the profile onto the leg and top piece. If you've ever cut dovetails before, you'll recognize that what I'm doing is basically the same process you'd use to cut dovetails. The support piece are the tails, and the leg and top receive the pins. So just like the pins of a dovetail, I cut down to the depth line on the walls, using my coping saw to remove the bulk of the waste, and then pare down to the final depth with my chisel. Finally, to finish the supports, I got out my mitered shooting board and trimmed each piece to the final dimension. Before gluing everything together, I needed to drill relief holes and cut a straight line for the wedge tenons. The purpose of drilling a hole in the tenon is to prevent the leg piece from developing a split as the wedge is hammered in. Without the hole, that force from driving the wedge could cause the leg to develop a split as it travels down the length of the wood, much like what happens when you split firewood. The hole therefore provides a big roadblock and prevents the wood from continuing to split. With that done, I could then glue everything together. As glue-ups go, this is a relatively straightforward one. I started by gluing in the legs and then gluing one support piece at a time. Then I used the clamp to not only bring everything together, but also help bring the leg square. You can't really see it, but I'm using my mechanic square along the bottom as I apply clamping pressure to make sure the leg is square. I glued on both support pieces and then hammered in the wedges on the tenons. I didn't really think to do this before putting the clamps on, which made hammering these in a little awkward. I was still able to get the job done, but on the other side I wised up and hammered the tenons before clamping, and while the legs were lying flat on the bench, which was a whole lot easier. Once the wedges were in, I then used the overly large clamps because they were the only size I had that would accommodate the width I needed to further clamp the support pieces in place. And because I have a limited number of clamps, I had to glue up each side one at a time. I then assembled the other side in the same manner, and once the glue was dried, I could use my rotary saw to cut down the wedges, and then use a plane to smooth and flatten everything out. I found that using a circular motion can sometimes help the plane when dealing with end grain like this. After a bit of planing, I was left with a nice smooth finish. You can see clearly the unfortunate chip out I got when chopping out the mortises. After repeating the same process for the remaining tenons, I could then do a few passes along the entire top, and then the last step before finish was to plane down the supports to make them flush with the legs and top. After a bit of further sanding, I could then put a finish on. For finish, I used Tried and True's original wood finish, which is pretty much the only finish I ever use. It won't give me the most durable finish, but I'm okay with that since I'm hoping over time this piece will see some use and develop some nice character. So with that, the project was finished. Other than the chip out I've mentioned, I was very happy with how this turned out. It was a fun project and one I would highly recommend to anyone looking for a quick project and or looking to practice hand-cut joinery. Finally, I'm starting to work on a video comparing the different shooting boards I've made and the pros and cons of each. So if that's something you're interested in, or if you enjoyed this video and want to follow along with my woodworking journey, then I'd love for you to consider subscribing. Thanks for joining me in this video.